pick up here. The Gospels were not yet written. They had no New Testament to bind them together. They disagreed on many things. For example, whether Christians had to be Jews, had to be circumcised, whether Christianity was a whole new religion. Some of Paul's letters show a leader struggling to bring order to this chaos. An agreed biblical canon, those books agreed as the official list, wasn't finally settled until centuries after Paul's death. The Bible read by Protestant Christians today is a standard canon of 27 books in the New Testament, 39 books in the Old Testament. Roman Catholic and Orthodox Christians have a set of additional books, often called the Apocrypha. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the only Gospels in the official canon, but as we'll see, plenty of other Gospels of Jesus had been written around the same time. The reality is, of course, we don't have anything from the first century. But anyway, the canon, okay, here we go. Ready? Are we ready to see the depth of the scholarship of the leading atheist as far as reputation or fame is concerned? The canon was largely fixed in AD 325 by a conference of church leaders called the Council of Nicaea. Set up by the Roman Emperor Constantine, the one whose conversion led to Europe becoming Christian. He made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Now, let me just stop for a moment and point out, once again, as we have pointed out for years, as soon as you hear any person say to you that the canon of the New Testament was decided at the Council of Nicaea, you're talking to someone who has no firsthand knowledge, no balanced knowledge, no meaningful knowledge of church history at all. You're talking to someone who has been educated by the internet and primarily YouTube on these particular subjects, because if you have spent time reading the primary sources on the Council of Nicaea, you know they did not address this subject. Now, there's one fellow who likes to throw out stuff, I think, just simply to make himself controversial and therefore pump his name some, who I won't mention directly at the moment. But there are some folks, such as this individual, who try to connect Nicaea to some type of canonicity just because, well, once you start discussing these things, then there is of necessity a discussion of canon, because if you're going to have ecumenical councils that are seeking to decide key theological issues, or at least to verify the decisions already made and exclude people, which in the case of Nicaea would be the exclusion of Arius and his followers, that there would have to be an establishment of canon. This would at very least be something that would prompt the official listing of a canon. You can make somewhat of an argument along those lines. The reality is that even Athanasius somehow felt that the knowledge that the church had of the canon at the time of Nicaea and immediately afterwards was sufficient without any type of official promulgation of a canon list, even when he provides us with that in his 39th Festal letter, 40 some odd years after the Council of Nicaea. Even when he does that, he's not going, oh, hey, I have the authority to do this for the entire church. He is representing what the church has already been functioning on at that particular point in time. But the point is, there are no canons and decrees of the Council of Nicaea that deal, not to go back to the Council of Nicaea, there's fake stuff later on, but not to go back to the Council of Nicaea. I'm reminded of Scott Butler trying to drag out the Arabic version of the canons and decrees of the Council of Nicaea to get around the actual canons and decrees, which provide problems for Roman Catholic views on the primacy of Peter and the Pope. Anyway, the Council of Nicaea did nothing in regards to promulgating a canon list, dealing with alleged competing gospels, of which there really aren't any. I mean, when you do look, and this is why a couple years ago, we may have to do it again, we had story time with Uncle Jimmy where I, grabbed various translations of Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Peter, infancy Gospel of Thomas. We read this stuff, and everybody in the audience is just sitting there going, "You mean those are the ones we're supposed to think were competitors and we're supposed to be included in the canon or something?" Obviously, from a completely different worldview, different time frame, different interests, just a whole different religion. But so one thing that's immediately obvious is that while Dr. Dawkins might know his biology well, he does not know history well at all, which should not surprise us. This did not surprise me at all. This is what I've experienced over and over and over again. But then secondarily, it's not a super important thing, but it's just simply fraudulent to say that Constantine, he made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. No, he did not. Theodosius did 60 years later. I mean, again, this is just factual stuff that if you did well in church history, but wasn't there an editor on this? I mean, look, I know some Christian writers. I know some Christian writers that are so impressed themselves that their editors lose a lot of sleep over editing any of their books, because if you dare say anything, this person, you may be kissing your career goodbye if you say a word. So maybe that's the way he is. I don't know. I don't know anything about the man personally. Anyways, we go on. But for Constantine, you'd probably have been brought up to worship Jupiter, Apollo, Minerva, and the other Roman gods. Much later, Christianity was spread across South America by another couple of great empires, the Portuguese Empire in Brazil, Spanish Empire on the rest of the continent. The widespread presence of Islam in North Africa, the Middle East, and Indian subcontinent is also the result of military conquest. I don't have any idea what any of that has to do with. As I said, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were only 4 out of a large number of Gospels doing the rounds at the time of the Council of Nicaea. Doing the rounds with who? I'll come on to some of the lesser-known Gospels in a moment. And any of them could have been included in the canon, but for various reasons, none of them made it. No, we know why they weren't. We know that there are only 4 from the first century. There are only 4 that have any meaningful claim to having been written in the middle of that century by someone who lived and walked in Israel, who could describe the number of porticos at the Pool of Bethesda and get it accurate, even though we only dug it up about 20 years ago. The other alleged Gospels come from minimally 100 years after Jesus and give unmistakable evidence of their fictional character. Does Richard Dawkins know this? Evidently not. Does he care? It's not been my experience, to be perfectly honest with you, in any of my encounters with the Richard Dawkinses of the world that they do. It is interesting to me that it's clear that Dawkins is dependent upon Ehrman, but Ehrman doesn't make those mistakes. Ehrman doesn't say the canon was fixed at Nicaea or something. He knows. So it's almost like there's it would just take me too much work, too much time to figure out what those Christians are really saying. But often it was because they were judged heretical, which just means they said things at odds with the orthodox beliefs of council members. So notice this idea that the council was examining these things. The reality is those Gospels were recognized as Gnostic heresies long before Constantine took his first breath. Partly it was because they were written slightly more recently than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, such as... I mean, there is absolutely zero evidence anywhere. I mean, maybe he's talking about the wild-eyed, crazy theories that a few people threw out about this Gospel of Peter thing, which is clearly Gnostic in origination. I know that John Dominic Crossan talked about that, and there have been some that tried to say that that's the earliest, but it's absurd. Anyway. But as we've seen, even Mark, partly it was because they were written slightly more recently than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but as we've seen, even Mark wasn't written early enough to be potentially reliable history. Which, okay, this level of hyper-skepticism means that nothing from history is knowable. Nothing. If Mark being written in the 40s or 50s is too late, so is Tacitus, Pliny, Suetonius, and any of the Greek historians. They're all throw it out. The favored four Gospels were chosen in part for weird reasons which owe more to poetic fancy than to history. And he talks about some strange sayings from Irenaeus and a few things like that. Oh, then check this out. Now I'm only going to mention this because, as some might know, we my fellow pastor Jeff has stepped out of Matthew chapter 24 for a little while. Not for long, but having been in Matthew pretty much for like 7 years, he's finished up the Olivet Discourse. Now, I think the Olivet Discourse took about 7 months. Now, that's not preaching every Sunday. I've preached a number of times in there. I did a whole series on the Lord's Supper during that time period. But one of the things that Jeff pounded when going through the Olivet Discourse was opponents of the faith attack Jesus as a prophet based upon certain interpretations that are forced upon Matthew chapter 24 by particular eschatological perspectives. And they say, look, Jesus said this is what's going to happen. That didn't happen. Therefore, Jesus was not a prophet. Case in point. Now, this isn't Matthew 24, but you'll see. Okay, here's Dawkins again. The book of Revelation, by the way, wasn't added to the canon until a century later, and it's a pity it ever was. Some guy called John had a weird dream one night on an island called Patmos, and he wrote it down. We all have dreams. Many of them are pretty weird. Mine almost always are, but I don't write them down. I certainly don't think they're interesting enough to inflict upon other people. John's dream was weirder than most, almost as though he was on drugs. It has become hugely influential simply because it somehow got itself included in the biblical canon. It's thought to be prophetic and is often quoted by fiery preachers in America. He's British, of course. I just stop and just go, does he really not know any history of even Britain and the British preachers and that? Along with Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians, Revelation is the main inspiration for the idea of the rapture. It is also the source of the dangerous idea that the longed-for second coming of Jesus cannot happen until after the Battle of Armageddon. This belief is why some people in America long for an all-out war involving Israel and the Middle East. They think that war will be Armageddon. Thousands of people, especially in America since the remarkable popularity of the so-called Left Behind books, sincerely hold the nutty belief that the rapture is really going to happen and happen soon. There are even websites that advertise a paid service to look after your pet cat in the event that you are, without warning, hoisted bodily up to heaven. It's a shame people don't realize it was little more than chance which books got included in the canon and which books were left behind. So, all of the historical content of the Revelation, all of its connection to history, to Matthew 24. Do you think this atheist has any knowledge of any of that? At this point, I would say, no, I doubt that he does, but I'm not going to be as harsh on him as I am about the Council of Nicaea and the Roman history stuff. Because the Council of Nicaea and the Roman history stuff is part of the basic, fundamental, foundational documents that give us all the history of that time period. So anybody who wants to know the truth of that is able to know the truth of that. But on this subject, I got to give him some slack, just because if you are completely outside of the Christian faith and you look at the Christian faith on the subject of eschatology, yeah, when books sell tens of millions or hundreds of millions of copies, just because, and look, there are a lot of people, I encounter people all the time who have no idea that there is any other way of looking at eschatology than Hal Lindsey's way of looking at eschatology. They just don't know. They don't know anything about the discussions down to the history of the church, different perspectives, nothing. And then they hear you say something, you go, but what about, I've told the story many, many times, I'll be brief, but when we were on the cruise in 2007 in Hawaii, the D. James Kennedy Coral Ridge cruise, where Gary DeMar, R.C. Sproul, and myself were the primary speakers. We were doing a Q&A, and I'll never forget this Q&A. We're sitting, it's me, R.C., and Gary, and you're on it was one of the nicest setups I had ever seen. We are in an amphitheater, so the seats go up. So there's not a bad seat in the house. The acoustics were awesome. You know, if you needed to show something, there were screens. It was a really nice setup. It really was. But we're down at the bottom, and we're getting toward the end of the Q&A, and an elderly lady way up there puts her hand up, and she says, I forget exactly how she put it, but it was something along the lines of, do you think that, I think it had something to do with something that just happened in the news or something like that. Do you think that this will have any impact upon the date of the rapture? Yeah. And so I remember sort of looking over like this, and Gary started looking over like this, and RC's just doing this number, like, okay, who's gonna break the news to her about this particular subject? And I forget. I think we let Uncle Gary do it because that's his thing, and I think he just likes talking about that. But the grin on RC's face was pretty cool at that particular point in time. So anyway, so I get. But the point is, here's a guy. He's supposed to be all that and a bag of chips, right? I mean, there are atheists out there that view Richard Dawkins like he is the Messiah for people who don't believe in the supernatural. I mean, they will quote him. They get about as close as you can get to worshiping somebody. And yet the reality is, he writes books about how stupid the Bible is, but he has less than a freshman Bible student's knowledge of the actual history and background of the Bible. It is simply my experience that atheists and people on the left as a whole are unconcerned about this. They will make grand sweeping statements about Christianity, the scriptures. They don't do their homework. They do not allow the scriptures to speak for themselves. They don't worry about context. They don't worry about history. They don't worry about the fact that the Bible is filled with different kinds of literature, that Revelation is not the same thing as a gospel. It's not the same thing as an epistle. It's not the same thing as poetry. There's poetry in it, but it's not in and of itself poetic. All that kind of stuff, which is a given, should be a given, should be something we're certainly teaching our people regularly. These people just don't even concern themselves about it. And so obviously the statements they end up making are empty, vacuous, meaningless, but still accepted by many, many, many people. And we as Christians, we sit back and go, no, wait a minute. Wait a minute. You're not being fair. You are horribly misrepresenting the facts. You are making fundamental errors of research and argumentation, and you're ignoring different genres of literature, and you're not being truthful. And we ask to have the opportunity. We are rarely given the opportunity in media, in the academy. And I'm not including Bart Ehrman in this. Bart Ehrman is a scholar of these things, and I've said many times, my problems with Bart Ehrman are his conclusions, not generally the facts that he throws out. So, even though I mentioned him earlier, it would stun me if Ehrman would make this kind of basic level error about the Council of Nicaea or something like that. I just never seen him doing it. I mean, it's not that I haven't caught him on factual errors. It's just that they're generally not this kind of basic thing. They're, something that required a little bit more in-depth analysis of a particular text or something like that. Anyway, so we as Christians, when we're doing apologetics to the world, we have to realize that the person you're talking to reads Outgrowing God by Richard Dawkins, accepts it as an absolutely unquestionable source. And, well, Richard Dawkins, he's a scholar. Well, he's a biologist. That doesn't mean he knows anything about history at all. In fact, it may militate just the opposite, to be honest with you. There was a day when being a biologist actually suggested that you might know something about history, because there was a day centuries ago when human knowledge was much more integrated because it was not nearly as fractured and there wasn't as much to know. Now, today, we are so specialized, and the educational system encourages specialization, so that a general, broad knowledge in numerous fields is not really valued. It's not really considered to be a valuable thing. You're supposed to know everything you can in one narrow little spectrum, and you're excused if in the very next discipline over, you're completely clueless. That's in my opinion, one of the great downgrades in the modern educational paradigm that even Christians have bought into. So, why do I bring up all of this? Well, you will go on any university campus, and you will encounter people who've read anywhere from The Selfish Gene now through Outgrowing God and everything that came in between. And so you have to be prepared for that. You have to know how to respond to that kind of rhetoric. And also, if you buy the book, he's already got enough money. It doesn't matter one way or the other. If you buy the book and you stick it on your phone and you bookmark those things, and then it'd be really easy to have a couple quotes from a serious history book saying, Theodosius is the one that declared the Roman Empire to be Christian, not Constantine. The Council of Nicaea said nothing about the issue of the canon scripture. Who knows? Maybe that would be a way to go, I read the same book, and man, it started off with just face-plantingly bad research. So can you tell me why you believe what this guy has to say? Let me give you some examples. Might open a door. It might be a means of getting a few words in edgewise. So, think about it. Might be useful.